All right, so for our final lecture, where we'll talk about the politics of the early Cold War, we're going to take a look at the rest of the world. The Cold War will shift its focus as we move through the 1950s away from Europe, which is the primary point of contention for most of Truman's Cold War, so the late 40s and the early 50s, and into the third world, the rest of the globe, the developing world, if you like, as well. The first iteration of this that we'll see is the Korean War, but there are going to be other points of contention too. And so that's where we'll look today, as the Cold War in the third world. So the third world as a term is invented to describe developing countries that are aligned with neither of the major Cold War powers, and search for an economic model instead somewhere in between the two extremes, the United States and the Soviet Union. There is an impulse towards non-alignment with the Cold War superpowers among these third world countries, but none of them could really truly avoid Cold War politics. Decolonization is something that's going to play a huge role in the third world. One of the earliest places that we'll see this taking place is in India and Pakistan, beginning decolonization with the achievement of independence in 1947. The British Gold Coast, or Ghana, will achieve independence 10 years later, and we'll get a subsequent spread of independence movements across Asia and Africa in particular. Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, all these places will experience independence movements. In the context of the Cold War, there is some fear from the United States of communist influence in these countries. The Soviet Union very strongly supports the dissolution of the old empires, particularly the British empires. That's the main one that's left. You also have the participation of communists and socialists in a lot of the independence struggles in those colonial areas. The third world is also generally quite averse to Cold War alignment altogether, which the US kind of takes the attitude of, if you're not with me, then you're against me when it comes to it. And so we tended to lump all these third world countries in with Soviet aggression because we couldn't understand why they wouldn't want to be allied to us. The Cold War was also a determinant of where the US made alliances and interventions in the rest of the world. Covert subversion of foreign governments was a popular tool in the US arsenal. Each elected homegrown nationalist, not foreign agents, but would seek to reduce foreign corporate control over their economies, leading oftentimes to US agencies like this newly minted CIA to organize the overthrow of these governments. This is something that we'll see happening in places like Guatemala and Iran, which will have pretty substantial consequences for the US later on down the line. Unfortunately, not something we'll get to discuss in depth. We're also going to see the Middle East playing a big role in the extension of the containment policy. And that's a lot of times going to boil down to a particular crisis in the Middle East, the Suez Crisis. And I've got a short video for you to watch about that.
In 1956, an international conflict erupted over the Suez Canal, a waterway in Egypt. The incident became known as the Suez Crisis. The crisis put the world on edge, rattling diplomatic relationships and culminating in a threat of nuclear war. Before we can look at the timeline of the Suez Crisis and its aftermath, we have to look at the history of the Suez Canal itself. The modern Suez Canal opened in 1869 when Britain controlled Egypt. The canal created an artificial waterway between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, making trade more convenient between Europe and East Asia. The Suez Canal was of great importance to the British because it connected much of their empire. So when Egypt achieved independence in 1922, the British took measures to ensure their control over the canal. In 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty was signed by Britain and Egypt, allowing British troops to remain in the canal zone until 1956. But things were changing in Egypt. Under the leadership of military officers, Egyptians deposed their monarchy, and Gamal Abdel Nasser became the country's new president. By 1954, Nasser started to pressure the British to end their military presence in the Suez Canal zone. During the Cold War, Nasser's anti-imperialist agenda also gained him the approval of the Soviet Union's communist government and their leader, Nikita Khrushchev. In July of 1956, with financial and armed support from the Soviets, Nasser ordered Egyptian forces to seize the Suez Canal from the British and nationalize it, which means he made the canal Egypt's public property. He believed the tolls Egypt could collect from ships passing through would fully finance a large new hydroelectric project on the Nile, the Aswan Dam. For the next few months, Britain, France, Israel, and the United States scrambled to figure out how to handle Egypt's takeover of the Suez. On October 29, 1956, Israel attacked Egypt. Israel wanted to resolve the Suez crisis as well as reopen the Strait of Tiran, an important trade route Egypt had previously closed. 2 days later, British and French forces also attacked Egypt and took control of the area around the Suez Canal. The situation quickly escalated. By November 5, 1956, Khrushchev threatened to nuke Western Europe if Britain, Israel, and France did not withdraw from Egypt. United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned Khrushchev not to get directly involved. At the same time, Eisenhower was furious that Britain, France, and Israel had kept the U.S. in the dark about this plan. He threatened the three countries with economic sanctions if they did not withdraw from Egypt. Britain and France withdrew by December. Finally, Israel bowed to U.S. pressure in March of 1957, bringing the Suez Canal crisis to an end. Though the Suez crisis lasted less than a year, its effects were profound and long-lasting. Immediately, a United Nations peacekeeping force was sent in to supervise the ceasefire and to restore order. The Suez Canal was cleared and reopened. British Prime Minister Robert Anthony Eden quickly resigned. The Suez crisis strained the relationship between the United States and Britain. But as Cold War allies in NATO, the countries continued to work together. Both Britain and France, though, saw their influence as world powers diminished. The Suez crisis revealed who the real superpowers were in the world: the United States and the Soviet Union, a power structure that would stay in place for another 3 decades.
All right, so the Suez crisis is a defining moment for the Middle East and for Eisenhower's war. This is also very illustrative of what I was talking about with the Third World, and the fact that a lot of times the actions taken by Third World leaders are not necessarily directly related to the Cold War politics of the day, but the U.S. often saw them in very stark Cold War terms. We're really incapable of seeing gray areas. The Suez crisis also led to the issuance of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that a country could request American economic assistance or aid from the U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. It's also in this period that we see the origins of the Vietnam War. After the expulsion of the Japanese during the Second World War, Vietnam was established as a French colony. Anti-communism led the U.S. to ultimately aid the French in a fight against Vietnamese nationalists under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, however, Eisenhower declined the French request to send American troops, wary of yet another land war in Asia, ultimately forcing the French to agree to independence and to go to the negotiating table with Ho Chi Minh and his nationalists. An agreement was negotiated in Geneva which divided the country in two. North Vietnam would be under the control of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam would be under the control of the anti-communist dictator Diem. There was also a stipulation for an election to be held in 1956, which would determine reunification and under which regime Vietnam would be reunified. Ultimately, Diem, fearing that he would not be the popular winner of an election, refuses to hold them. And ultimately, the U.S. also supports the South Vietnamese efforts to scuttle the elections. Again, using the Cold War as the dominant compass by which we determine our foreign alliances and foreign policy decisions. This leads the United States to support the rather unpopular Diem regime in South Vietnam. This is going to lead to a protracted civil war between the two, which will ultimately involve hundreds of thousands of American troops in a war in the 1960s and 70s, a war that will ultimately prove to be unwinnable for the United States. All of these interventions will have some long-term legacies, not only in Vietnam, and despite the rhetoric of freedom, the U.S. seems far more comfortable with reliable military leaders, despots, rather than democratic ones. And considerable resentment will grow against the United States in the Third World and will ultimately lead to conflicts for the United States in the future.